Sycamore Heights was one of those suburbs that graced local real estate brochures, a place where trimmed hedges lined every driveway and the roofs of tidy homes gleamed under the sun's rays. Tree-shaded sidewalks wound around small, meticulously kept lawns. Neighbors waved at passing cars, dogs sniffed at neat flower beds, and kids bicycled along quiet cul-de-sacs. At a glance, it all seemed blissfully serene. Yet beneath this veneer of perfection, tensions simmered. The local homeowners association, HOA, wielded considerable power, setting and enforcing rules with an iron fist. At first, residents tolerated or even appreciated this oversight. It kept the lawns uniform, noise complaints to a minimum, and property values high. But in recent years, some HOA board members had become increasingly intrusive and self-important. None more so than Helena Roberts, better known, behind her back, as Karen. In theory, the HOA's purpose was to maintain harmony and shared amenities. In practice, those who felt the brunt of the rules often found them petty or unfair. This dynamic occasionally led to quiet grumbling. But no single incident had galvanized the entire community until Helena Roberts went too far with her aggression toward a wheelchair user. No one could have guessed that a short skirmish by Karen's porch would escalate into a fiasco that threatened to tear Sycamore Heights apart before ultimately drawing it together in a surprising way. Helena Roberts stood in her late 40s, with short, well-coiffed hair and an expression that constantly toggled between disapproving frown and forced politeness. On the official HOA roster, she was labeled Director of Community Standards, but neighbors privately dubbed her Karen, a nod to her habit of butting in, demanding to speak to the manager of any situation, and insisting she alone knew best. In her early days on the HOA board, Helena championed basic improvements, like repaving the tennis court or cleaning up the shared picnic area. Over time, however, she developed a taste for micromanagement. She loved scolding people about their trash bins, handing out violation notices over trivial matters like the hue of someone's garden gnome, and sending strongly worded emails in a crisp, businesslike font. Where other board members tried to balance empathy with enforcement, Karen reveled in her role as a rule enforcer. A prime example of her mindset was her approach to curb aesthetics. She once threatened to fine a newlywed couple for leaving wedding-themed paper lanterns on their porch 2 days past the allowed event period. She objected to a neighbor's wind chime for producing excessive tinkling. Another time, she demanded that a family move an inflatable kiddie pool from their side yard because it's an eyesore. The stories about her meddling were legendary. Despite her unpopularity among many, Karen retained her board position through a mix of intimidation, alliances with a few like-minded neighbors, and the general apathy of others who rarely attended HOA meetings. That complacency allowed her to tighten her grip on petty enforcement until she set her sights on an unwitting target, a local wheelchair user named David. David Cooper had moved to Sycamore Heights 4 years earlier, drawn by the quiet suburban ambience, smooth sidewalks, and reputedly well-maintained amenities. He needed a reliable area to maneuver in his wheelchair, a daily necessity since a spinal cord injury left him with limited mobility. Though he lived alone in a one-story house, he had a network of supportive friends and occasionally used local ride services to get around. On good days, he rolled himself around the neighborhood or powered up his motorized attachment, greeting neighbors with a warm smile. Mostly, David's life in Sycamore Heights was pleasant. He found the area accessible enough for his needs: curb cuts and sidewalks, wide driveways, minimal steps at the local community center. A few small improvements, like smoother crosswalk transitions, would have been nice, but he managed. He frequently chatted with some older residents in the late afternoons or joined a monthly game night at a neighbor's house. On his porch, he maintained a tidy arrangement of potted plants that he watered from a seated position. However, David occasionally encountered minor irritations. For example, some neighbors would stare or ask personal questions about his wheelchair. He also noticed how certain HOA rules weren't exactly flexible for people with disabilities, but as long as no one actively blocked his needs, he shrugged it off. He had heard whispers of a controlling HOA board member nicknamed Karen, but their paths hadn't crossed in a consequential way yet. David's routine rarely put him on her radar. But one unassuming day, a minor mishap with his wheelchair would bring him face to face with Karen's brand of aggression. On a warm summer afternoon, David was on his way back from visiting a friend at the other end of Sycamore Heights. He navigated the gentle slope of the sidewalk, noticing he was about half a block away from home. A squeak in his wheelchair's front caster wheel signaled that something was off, perhaps a small piece of gravel lodged in the axle or a loose bolt. Not wanting to risk further damage, David decided to pull over somewhere quiet to investigate. At that moment, he spotted a wide and used porch area near the corner. No one seemed to be outside, and the porch steps were off to the right, so the area before the front door was flat and open, perfect to pause for a moment. David steered himself carefully onto the porch's paved edge, turned off the motor, and bent forward to inspect the noisy wheel. He kept an extra folding seat, a lightweight, collapsible stool, strapped to the back of his wheelchair, so he could reposition or rest items if needed. Sometimes it served as a surface for his tools or a place for a companion to sit. David was so focused on the squeaky wheel that he didn't notice the door behind him creak open. Nor did he realize that the porch he was on belonged to Helena Karen Roberts. She had heard the faint hum of the motor and the scuff of wheels. Curious, and always eager to investigate, she peeked out her door. Her eyes locked onto David's wheelchair. A scowl instantly formed on her face. "Excuse me," she snapped, stepping onto the porch. "What are you doing?" Startled, David turned. "I'm sorry if this is your home. My wheelchair wheel is acting up. I just needed a spot to check it." Karen's eyebrows shot upward. "On my porch? I don't think so." She folded her arms. "You can't just trespass on private property whenever you feel like it." "It's just for a minute," David said politely. "I didn't realize it was an issue. I thought it might be a public walkway extension." Indeed, the porch was unusually large and set flush with the sidewalk, lacking a fence or gate. He hadn't recognized it as part of someone's private entrance. Karen's voice grew sharper. "You and that contraption need to leave. Now." "It's not a contraption, it's my wheelchair," David replied, annoyance creeping into his tone. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding, but let me just fix this wheel, and I'll be out of your way." Karen pursed her lips. "You can't expect me to accommodate every random person who decides to sit in front of my home. Do you have any idea how many rules you're breaking?" She gestured vaguely, as if a rulebook hovered in the air. "I'm on the HOA board. This porch is not a wheelchair waiting area." At that point, David realized the conversation was going nowhere. "All right, I'll move. Didn't mean to intrude," he said. He tried turning the wheel to go, but the squeak was worse than ever, and the caster stuck. He fiddled with a small wrench, attempting a quick fix. Meanwhile, Karen hovered, arms still crossed, her foot tapping impatiently. Each time he tried to maneuver, the wheel jerked awkwardly. "Could you at least let me fix this so I can move on safely?" "It won't take long," he reasoned, frustration mounting. Karen rolled her eyes. "I guess I have no choice," she huffed. "But hurry up. I don't want you loitering around here." Shrugging off her rudeness, David refocused on his wheelchair, determined to finish quickly. He had no idea that this minor run-in would only be the start of a larger confrontation. For the moment, he chalked it up to an unfriendly homeowner. Within a few minutes, he tweaked the loose bolt, tested the wheel, and rolled away, ignoring Karen's glare. He hoped that would be the last he'd see of her. It wouldn't be. Word of David's encounter with Karen spread quickly through Sycamore Heights. Neighbors had a knack for swapping stories. The porch incident might have faded if Karen had chosen to let it go. But in her mind, David's presence on her porch was a personal affront. She complained to her close-knit circle in the HOA, describing the scenario in melodramatic detail. "He was lurking by my front door, rummaging around with some squeaky wheelchair, as if my property was a public workshop." Although a few fellow board members listened politely, they didn't share her outrage. Some quietly asked, "Couldn't you have just let him fix his wheel?" Others pointed out that David's wheelchair use was protected by disability rights. None of this appeased Karen. She insisted that an HOA rule must exist against abandoning personal devices on private property, framing David's few moments on her porch as a trespass and safety hazard. Meanwhile, David tried to move on with his life, though the memory rankled. He confided in a friend that he'd never experienced such hostility over a simple stop. "She acted like I was polluting her porch," he said, shaking his head. "I was only there long enough to adjust my wheel." Soon, new wrinkles emerged. On subsequent trips around the neighborhood, David noticed Karen giving him pointed stares. If he happened to roll down a sidewalk near her house, she'd stand on her lawn, arms folded, eyes tracking him until he was out of sight. It was unsettling. Once, while passing by, he thought he heard her mutter under her breath, "Find somewhere else to loiter." He tried ignoring her. Sycamore Heights was large enough that he could usually avoid her corner, but appointments, errands, and social calls sometimes forced him to cross her path. On one such day, the squeak returned. Nervous about a repeat confrontation, David tried to keep going until he reached his own driveway. But halfway there, the wheel jammed, nearly causing him to tip sideways. Panicked, he pulled over at the next patch of shade. Luckily, it was far from Karen's house, this time, anyway. One muggy afternoon, a month after their initial encounter, David's wheelchair battery began to lose charge faster than usual. He'd been out longer than planned, visiting a friend, stopping by the pharmacy, grabbing groceries from a convenience store. On his way home, he recognized that the battery gauge was nearly in the red. If he didn't pause to switch to manual mode or charge it briefly, he risked getting stuck. By a twist of bad luck, the best route to his home involved passing Karen Street. With a sense of dread, he rolled along, hoping the motor would hold out just enough to avoid stopping near her property. But the battery beeped an alarm a mere block away from her corner. He switched to manual mode, using his arms to propel forward, but the transition was cumbersome. A slight slope in the sidewalk forced him to rest more often. Finally, he found a small, level patch of pavement near the curb, technically part of the public walkway. But Karen's front porch loomed just a few feet behind him. Before he could fully catch his breath, the front door opened. Out marched Karen, a thunderous scowl on her face. "What do you think you're doing here again?" she barked. "I told you to stay away from my property." David inhaled, controlling his frustration. "I'm not on your porch. My battery's dying, and I just need to rest for a minute so I can push the rest of the way home." Karen advanced, gaze flicking to the wheelchair, then to the small folding seat strapped behind it. She noticed David occasionally used that seat as a spare or to hold items. To her, it seemed like clutter. "This is still too close," she snapped. "You need to move along. I can't have you constantly lurking near my house." He bristled. "I have a right to use the public sidewalk. And I'm not doing anything but resting." Karen's nostrils flared. She stabbed a finger at the ground. "Go rest somewhere else, then. Your wheelchair might scratch the curb or block neighbors. Who knows if you'll just park here for hours." David frowned, sweat beading on his forehead from the humidity and the exertion of rolling manually. "Look," he said, struggling to remain calm. "I'll be gone in a few minutes once I catch my breath." "Is that so terrible?" Karen's voice rose. "Yes, it is. You're not above the rules. You can't park that contraption wherever you please." She took a menacing step forward, eyes darting to the small folding chair behind him. "What even is that?" "Another piece of junk. It's a folding seat," David answered, exasperated. "Sometimes I need it. If I have a friend with me, or I want to transfer to a different seat. It's none of your business." Without warning, Karen lunged. Her hands clamped onto the folding seat. "I'm sick of you and your junk cluttering my view." She yanked it free from the wheelchair's back hook. Shocked, David tried to grab for it, but he almost toppled. His arms were needed to balance himself. "Hey, that's my property," David shouted. But Karen turned, stomping toward the curb. Then, in a flash of anger, she hurled the folding chair out toward the street. The scene moved in slow motion. The folding chair soared over the curb, landing with a metallic clang in the roadway. A passing car swerved to avoid it, tires screeching. Another vehicle braked sharply, narrowly missing the chair. A chorus of honks erupted, echoing up and down the street. David watched in horror as the seat skittered and spun, nearly causing a chain reaction crash. Adrenaline flooded him. "Are you crazy? You could have caused a major accident," he exclaimed, voice cracking with panic. Karen stood there, breathing heavily, a strange mix of anger and sudden regret flickering in her eyes. But she refused to apologize. Instead, she spat. "Next time, keep that junk away from my property." From the sidewalk, a neighbor who had just stepped outside witnessed the final moments. She gasped, rushing forward. "What's going on here?" she cried. Another onlooker hurried to grab the folding chair from the street before more cars arrived. The driver of the swerving car rolled down the window to hurl curses at the chaos, then sped off once the way was clear. David's heart hammered in his chest. He felt vulnerable and furious, uncertain if he should call the police right then. Karen, confronted by the neighbor's shocked expressions, snapped back inside her house, slamming the door. The neighbor who retrieved the folding chair returned it to David with a trembling hand. "Are you okay?" she asked, voice hushed. "I saw her throw this. That was insane." He nodded, swallowing, his throat dry. "I'm okay. My wheel's battery died, so I was resting." He took a steadying breath. She freaked out, snatched the chair. Appalled, the neighbor offered to push him to a safer spot. Together, they moved several houses down, away from Karen's stoop, while more stunned bystanders gathered. Whispers filled the air. That was unbelievably dangerous. She threw a piece of medical equipment into traffic. She's lost it this time. David realized that despite his shock and anger, he was safe, and the near accident hadn't harmed anyone. But the gravity of Karen's action sank in. This was no longer a petty scolding or HOA rule enforcement. She had physically seized his property and launched it into the street, potentially endangering lives. How could such a thing happen in a suburban neighborhood supposedly known for civility? The police arrived a short while later, summoned by a passerby. David, still shaken, recounted the incident. He was hesitant to press immediate charges. He'd never navigated such a legal path before. But the officer took statements from him and from witnesses who had seen Karen fling the folding chair. Karen, from behind her locked door, refused to come out for a conversation. The officer left a summons slip in her mailbox, instructing her to visit the station if she wished to file her own statement. News of the confrontation spread rapidly through Sycamore Heights. Some neighbors were outraged by Karen's brazen act, labeling it assault or reckless endangerment. Others, who had disliked Karen's controlling ways for years, seized this moment as a rallying cry for her removal from the HOA board. A few folks worried about blowback. Karen had allies in the board, and she was known for stirring up trouble. David found himself at the center of attention. Strangers approached to express sympathy. Some offered to help with daily tasks or to accompany him on errands so he wouldn't have to risk being alone near Karen's property again. Although he appreciated the outpouring of support, David felt uneasy. He never wanted this kind of spotlight. He just wanted to live quietly and safely. Meanwhile, the chair itself was scuffed, but not destroyed. David's friend, who owned a woodworking shop, offered to fix any dents or misalignments. The friend also recommended reinforcing the hooks on David's wheelchair so that no one could so easily snatch off the seat again. David welcomed the kindness, though the event's emotional toll lingered. Each time he recalled the moment Karen flung his property into the street, his pulse quickened. He realized that things wouldn't just go back to normal. Not after a near disaster like that. Within days, Sycamore Heights was abuzz with conversations. A post on the community's online forum recounted the story in vivid detail, triggering a flood of comments. "I've had it with Karen. This is beyond controlling, it's violent. We can't tolerate such behavior in our neighborhood. Does the HOA even have rules about wheelchair users stopping briefly? If not, they should. I hope David presses charges." Some individuals who generally supported strict HOA guidelines stepped back, appalled at Karen's aggression. Others, including a small group who typically admired Karen's no-nonsense enforcement, found themselves torn, unsure how to defend her after she threw a chair into the street. Rumors circulated that the next HOA meeting would be tumultuous, with calls to sanction or remove Karen. Board members quietly debated how to handle the scandal. Publicly, the HOA president issued a statement condemning dangerous actions that threaten neighbors' well-being, carefully not naming Karen but implying that her behavior was unacceptable. Meanwhile, a few residents devised a plan to help wheelchair users or others with mobility issues who might need quick fixes, a direct response to the fiasco. They proposed installing a small, emergency wheelchair repair station near the complex entrance. This station would include a basic set of tools for adjusting wheels or handles, plus a fold-up chair or bench. If someone had a breakdown or needed to rest, they could do so safely in a designated area. The idea was to turn a painful incident into a constructive improvement for the community. David, hearing about the plan, was touched. He liked the concept of a safe stop for wheelchair users, acknowledging that not everyone realized how small mechanical troubles could hinder mobility. And if it prevented future conflicts with unwelcoming homeowners, so much the better. The next HOA board meeting took place in the community center's multipurpose room. Normally, about a dozen people showed up. This time, the room was packed to capacity, with over 50 residents in attendance. A murmur of conversation filled the air as folks awaited the official start. Karen was present, seated in her usual spot at the table reserved for board members, arms folded and face set in a grim expression. Her posture seemed defensive, as if bracing for an onslaught. The HOA president, a mild-mannered older man named Martin Green, cleared his throat and called the meeting to order. After routine agenda items, like approving the minutes from the last session, he addressed the main issue. We are here to discuss the recent incident in which an HOA board member, Ms. Helena Roberts, forcibly removed a folding seat belonging to a resident, resulting in said item being thrown into the street and nearly causing a traffic accident. A collective hush fell, punctuated by a few audible gasps or muttered exclamations. Martin continued, "We understand the police were called, statements were taken, and the matter remains under review. Our job tonight is not to determine legal guilt or innocence, but to address the possible violation of HOA policy, the potential danger to the community, and the broader question of how to ensure accessibility for all residents." He then invited David to speak. Rolling up to the microphone, David introduced himself, voice steady but tinged with lingering frustration. He described the moment Karen grabbed his folding chair. He recounted how it landed in the road, causing chaos and near collisions. Several times, he had to pause to calm his nerves. "I never wanted a fight," David concluded. "All I needed was a place to rest my wheelchair or fix it. I never expected a board member to lash out with physical aggression. Now I just hope we can move forward in a way that ensures this doesn't happen to anyone else." Soft applause rippled through the crowd. Karen glared at him, saying nothing yet, her jaw tense. Martin then opened the floor to board members. A woman named Angela, known for her moderate stance, expressed horror at the incident. "We must stand firmly against any intimidation or physical altercation," she said. Another board member, Rick, nodded, lamenting that community trust is shattered when things come to violence. Finally, Martin turned to Karen. "Ms. Roberts, do you have any statement?" Karen inhaled sharply. "I regret that the item landed in the street," she began, though her tone was devoid of genuine remorse. "However, I maintain that Mr. Cooper was repeatedly trespassing near my property, ignoring our guidelines about loitering. I was protecting my home from becoming a makeshift rest stop." An outcry arose from the audience. People shouted, "It's a sidewalk, not your private domain. He was in a wheelchair. That doesn't justify throwing anything into traffic." Martin banged a small gavel for order. Karen pressed on stubbornly. "I've seen him near my house multiple times." It felt invasive. The item in question was a nuisance. "I removed it, admittedly in a moment of frustration, but I had no intention of causing an accident." Her words ended in a petulant huff. The tension in the room was palpable. Many residents glowered at Karen, unconvinced by her half-hearted explanation. Martin announced that the board would retire to a private session after hearing everyone's comments, then present a decision about possible disciplinary actions. But more than mere discipline hung in the air. People wanted a change in leadership, as well as some formal measure to show the HOA cared about residents with disabilities. During the public comment period, one of David's friends, a neighbor named Gina, stepped forward. She cleared her throat. "I'd like to propose something constructive," she said, pulling out a small set of sketches. "Several of us want to install an emergency wheelchair repair station near the main entrance of Sycamore Heights. It would be a small kiosk with basic tools, an air pump for wheelchair tires, maybe a bench or a foldable seat. The idea is to give people with mobility devices a safe place to pause if they have mechanical trouble or need to rest." Eyes bright with interest, Gina displayed the sketches on a projector screen. The station looked modest, just a little cabinet with a hinged top, plus a sign designating it as a safe stop. She went on to say, "We can't change what happened, but we can ensure it doesn't repeat. No one should feel forced to stop on someone's porch just to tighten a wheel or rest a moment. This station could benefit not only wheelchair users, but also seniors with walkers or parents pushing strollers who might need a quick fix." A hush of appreciation spread through the crowd. David smiled, touched by his neighbor's initiative. Even some board members, who moments earlier had been bracing for arguments, nodded approvingly. It was a rare positive turn in an otherwise tense meeting. Martin asked about cost. Gina explained they planned to crowdsource funds from supportive neighbors, and maybe the HOA could allocate a small budget for final installation. The total expense was minimal, especially compared to some bigger HOA projects. The synergy of the idea won over the room. Karen sat stiffly, arms crossed, expression sour, but didn't immediately voice an objection. Perhaps she realized how negative it would sound to oppose an accessible amenity after her chair-throwing fiasco. Or maybe she was simply fuming in silence, calculating some future move. For the moment, the tide of public sentiment was firmly in favor of the new station. The board ended the public discussion with a promise to deliberate in closed session. Residents milled around the community center foyer, talking in hushed groups, speculating about what the final decision on Karen's fate would be. David fielded a wave of questions and thanks. "We're so sorry you went through this. Please let us know if you need anything." Or, "We support you, David." She can't get away with it. Inside the private room, the board wrestled with how to handle a situation so unprecedented. They consulted HOA bylaws, which spelled out procedures for dealing with board member misconduct, including anything that posed a threat to resident safety. Some members argued for immediate removal of Karen from her position. Others felt that might invite legal complications, given she'd technically been voted in at the last election. Another faction suggested a strong censure, plus suspension of certain privileges. Ultimately, after nearly an hour, the board reconvened. Martin addressed the room. First, regarding Ms. Roberts' recent actions, the board has decided to issue a formal censure for endangering both the residents' property and the safety of others on the street. Effective immediately, Ms. Roberts will lose her authority to issue citations or warnings independently. Any enforcement matter must be approved by at least one other board member. Furthermore, we strongly recommend Ms. Roberts step down from her directorship. If she does not, the board will consider further measures, up to a special removal vote. A clamor of cheers and applause erupted. Karen's face paled. She glared at Martin as though betrayed, but even her usual allies on the board avoided her gaze. Martin continued. Second, regarding the proposed emergency wheelchair repair station, the board wholeheartedly supports the community's initiative. We will allocate a modest budget supplement, and the station can be installed near the main entrance. This amenity will benefit not just wheelchair users, but anyone needing a safe, accessible spot to rest or make quick repairs. More enthusiastic cheers followed. People turned to David with encouraging smiles, and he nodded gratefully. Although his emotions were complex, relief that the incident was taken seriously, sadness that it had to come to this in the first place, and a measure of satisfaction that a positive outcome might result. Karen rose abruptly, stepping away from the board table. She spat out, "This is a witch hunt. You're all punishing me for doing my job." Then she stormed out of the room before further questions could be asked. Her departure left a swirl of tension behind, but most residents seemed glad to see her go, at least for the evening. For the next few weeks, Karen retreated from public HOA activities. She posted lengthy diatribes on the neighborhood forum, trying to justify her actions. We shouldn't encourage people to sprawl on others' property just because they can't be bothered to plan their route. She also raged against the board for bowing to mob pressure and insisted she had been set up by David to make her look bad. The posts drew scorn and disbelief from the community. A few of her staunch supporters tried to defend her, but most recognized that throwing a chair into traffic was indefensible. Under the censure, Karen was no longer able to roam the neighborhood, handing out petty violation notices. She attempted to rally other board members to her side, but they distanced themselves, not wanting further association with her outbursts. Rumors spread that a petition to recall her seat might soon appear, though official recall processes were cumbersome. In her personal life, Karen found the social climate had changed. People who once tolerated her abrupt style now openly avoided her. At the grocery store, neighbors quickly turned their carts away if they spotted her. She was left in an isolated bubble, seething at a suburban community that refused to see her as the righteous enforcer she believed herself to be. Meanwhile, David's daily routine continued. He avoided Karen's street when possible, though ironically, after the meltdown, she rarely emerged from her front porch anyway. The new repair station was still in the planning stage, with neighbors brainstorming design elements. Some had asked David for input on what tools might be most useful for wheelchair maintenance. He happily contributed a list: an Allen wrench set, small screwdrivers, a pressure gauge for tires, and an adjustable spanner. On an emotional level, David grappled with lingering anxiety about the incident. He sometimes woke at night, replaying the moment the chair flew into the street. Yet the community's empathy buoyed him, as did the promise of a permanent resource that might spare others from a similar confrontation. The sense of unity that blossomed after Karen's meltdown proved more healing than he could have anticipated. A mild autumn weekend found a group of volunteers gathering by the main entrance of Sycamore Heights. They had marked a small patch of ground near the corner, where the sidewalk was wide and a streetlight provided visibility. The brand-new emergency wheelchair repair station kit arrived in boxes, courtesy of both HOA funds and private donations. The group included Gina, the project's originator, Angela, the more sympathetic board member, David, and several handy neighbors. The station itself featured a sturdy metal pedestal with a lockable cabinet containing basic tools, a small overhang for weather protection, a foldable bench seat that could pop out when needed, allowing someone to sit or transfer from a wheelchair. Clear signage reading, "Sycamore Heights Mobility Stop, all welcome." They spent a few hours installing it, drilling the pedestal into a solid concrete base for stability. David supervised the layout, ensuring the station was comfortably accessible for a wheelchair user rolling up. Once assembled, the station looked neat and functional, hardly an eyesore. Passers-by paused to watch and sometimes offered compliments or snacks to the volunteers. When it was done, the neighbors took turns testing the foldable bench and verifying that the tools were user-friendly. David pinned a small laminated guide that explained how to use the wrenches for various wheelchair adjustments. Gina snapped photos for the HOA newsletter, proclaiming, "Our new amenity is here to serve residents who need a quick fix or a safe rest." Another step toward an inclusive, caring community. At that moment, Karen's saga felt distant. People joked quietly, "Bet Karen hates this," or, "If she tries to throw these tools, at least they're chained to the station." But mostly, they savored the positivity. A fiasco that began with hostility had produced a helpful resource that might serve residents for years to come. With the station installed, a wave of goodwill swept over Sycamore Heights. Residents who had never interacted much with David now saw him as a friendly neighbor rather than just the guy in the wheelchair. Some older folks discovered they, too, could benefit from a rest spot while walking dogs or carrying groceries. A mother of twins found the bench handy when adjusting a stroller's loose wheel. The station quickly became more broadly appreciated than originally expected. David noticed that the entire tone of the neighborhood had warmed. People became more conscious of the challenges faced by those with mobility issues. Some started advocating for better lowered curbs or more bench seating around the block. The spirit of communal improvement overshadowed the memory of Karen's destructive act, though no one forgot how it had galvanized them in the first place. As for Karen, her attempts to spin the narrative faltered. More calls for her resignation circulated. She refused to step down, but with her enforcement authority clipped, she had little influence. The board functioned more smoothly without constant meddling from her. She retreated into her house, rarely seen outside except for brief errands. When she did appear at the occasional board meeting, her presence was subdued and overshadowed by constructive dialogue about neighborhood issues. Legally, the police concluded their initial investigation with no formal charges pressed. David decided not to pursue them in court, though the option had been on the table. He felt that the HOA's censure and Karen's near ostracism were sufficient consequences, along with the knowledge that the entire neighborhood disapproved of her actions. In time, the tension that once haunted David whenever he passed Karen's corner dissipated. He found alternative routes, and if he happened to come close, he did so with quiet confidence. No more lurking fear that someone might seize his property or threaten him physically. The community had his back. The station, gleaming near the entrance, was a tangible testament to that unity. Months passed, and Sycamore Heights settled into a new normal. The wheelchair repair station remained a well-maintained fixture. Local teenagers sometimes used the tools for bike repairs, carefully returning them after use. Retirees sat on the bench to rest during morning walks. David frequently wheeled by to ensure everything was in order, occasionally refilling tire patches or lubricating the tool hinges. Karen's name slipped to the margins of daily conversation. The board, now more balanced, focused on practical upgrades, like improved lighting around mail kiosks or fresh landscaping near the playground. A sense of communal spirit thrived, as though the confrontation had jolted people out of their complacency. They realized that an HOA could be an agent of good when it embraced inclusion rather than aggression. David, for his part, found fulfillment in small but meaningful ways. He volunteered for a new accessibility committee forming within Sycamore Heights, dedicated to ensuring all neighborhood improvements considered the needs of folks with disabilities, parents with strollers, or seniors with walkers. He joked with Gina that they might one day have a ramp installed at every tricky curb. Baby steps, she teased. But hey, we're well on our way. Looking back, the memory of Karen's furious act, tossing a folding chair into the street, still stirred a pang of disbelief. How had a neighborhood squabble escalated so drastically? Yet David also saw how that moment had spurred an outpouring of empathy and collective problem-solving. In a twist of irony, Karen's meltdown became the catalyst for a robust amenity that was widely appreciated. Life was never perfect. Petty disputes still arose over trash can placement or holiday decorations, and not everyone was best friends. Yet an undercurrent of solidarity now pulsed through Sycamore Heights. When neighbors united, they could override the negativity of one individual. And every time David passed by the repair station or hopped off his wheelchair to rest on the fold-up bench, he felt a gentle wave of relief, gratitude, and pride in a community that chose compassion over hostility.